I am staring at a federal court filing right now, and something is missing. Something big, something that changes everything about Melania Trump's lawsuit against journalist Michael Wolff. And when I figured out what was missing, I had to sit back and just think about what this means. See, Melania Trump demanded $1 billion from Michael Wolff back in October. $1 billion. That's not a typo, not a mistake. $1 billion with a B. She sent him a letter demanding he retract his reporting about her relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, demanding an apology, and oh yeah, demanding $1 billion in damages. And you know what fascinating? In her new federal court filings, in the documents her lawyers just submitted in the last 24 hours, that billion-dollar demand has completely disappeared, vanished, like it never happened. And I think I know why, and it terrifies me about what we are watching happen in real time. But before I get into that, let me tell you what Michael Wolff actually did that has Melania so desperate to silence him. Because this isn't just about one journalist. This is about whether the First Amendment still means anything when you read dealing with the Trump family. This is about whether billion-dollar threats can be used to crush anyone who asks uncomfortable questions about Epstein. And based on what I am seeing in these court documents, I believe we are watching an attempt to establish a terrifying precedent. So Michael Wolff is a journalist. He written extensively about Donald Trump, including several best-selling books, and he also been chronicling the Jeffrey Epstein story. Now, according to his reporting, there are connections between Melania and Epstein that she really doesn't want people talking about. The specifics of what he reported, I am going to be careful here because this is obviously contested, but he written about the nature of their relationship, about how Melania and Donald first met, about the social circles they ran in. And in October, Melania's Florida lawyer sent Wolff a letter. Not just any letter, a demand letter claiming his reporting was false, malicious, and defamatory. Fair enough, right? If someone writes something false about you, you can ask for a retraction. That's normal. That happens all the time. But here's what's not normal. The letter demanded $1 billion. $1 billion from a journalist for doing journalism. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that is just a negotiating tactic. Rich people throw around big numbers all the time. But I don't think that's what this was. I think this was something much more calculated and much more dangerous. Because what happened next tells you everything. Michael Wolff didn't back down. He didn't retract anything. He didn't apologize. Instead, he ran straight to court. He filed what called a declaratory judgment action in New York State Supreme Court. Basically, he asked a judge to declare that what he wrote was good journalism, not defamation. He went on offense. And that when things got really interesting, because for 4 whole months, Melania Trump dodged service. Now, let me explain what that means for anyone not familiar with legal process. When you get sued, the other side has to formally serve you with the lawsuit. They have to get those papers into your hands according to specific legal rules. And you can make that difficult. You can avoid process servers. You can claim you weren't properly served. But here is the thing. Judges hate that. State court judges hate it. Federal court judges hate it even more. So for 4 months, the former First Lady of the United States, a woman with Secret Service protection and multiple residences and lawyers on retainer, somehow couldn't be served with a lawsuit. Just couldn't seem to accept those papers. And all the while, Michael Wolff is sitting there with his lawsuit filed, and she not responding, and the clock is ticking. Finally, she hired a law firm, a big law firm called DLA Piper. And you know who they usually represent? Donald Trump, in his corporate matters. So the Trump family lawyer is now representing Melania in this case. And the very first thing they did was file what called a removal notice. They were trying to move the case from New York State court to federal court. Now, why would they do that? On the surface, they reclaiming it about jurisdiction. They were saying this should be in federal court because of something called diversity jurisdiction. That when you have parties from different states and the amount in controversy exceeds $75,000. Melania claims she lives in Florida, Wolff lives in New York, so federal court, right? But I don't think that's the real reason. I think the real reason is much more strategic, and it's something that should worry every single person who cares about press freedom. Because if they can get this case into federal court in New York, then they can ask that federal judge to transfer the case to Florida, to the Southern District of Florida. And in the Southern District of Florida, there is a 1 in 2 chance, a 50% chance of getting Judge Aileen Cannon assigned to the case. Judge Cannon, remember her? The Trump-appointed judge who bent over backwards to help Trump in the classified documents case, the judge whose rulings were so biased that even conservative legal scholars were appalled, that Judge Cannon. And if Melania can get her case in front of Judge Cannon, well, suddenly that billion-dollar threat doesn't seem so crazy, does it? This is what I am calling the Cannon 112 step. It is choreographed, it is calculated. Remove the case to federal court, claim you need it transferred to Florida for jurisdiction reasons, get Judge Cannon, and suddenly you've got a friendly judge who might just be willing to crush a journalist for writing about Epstein connections. And here, where it gets even more disturbing. The federal judge who got assigned to this case in New York is named Vitas Vokasel. He, a Trump appointee. Yes, there are very few Trump-appointed judges in New York, but they managed to pull one, and Judge Vokasel is already showing some attitude about this case. When Wolff's lawyers tried to remind him about his obligation to determine whether federal court even has jurisdiction, the judge basically snapped at them. He wrote in an order that he doesn't need to be reminded about his obligations, like, okay, judge, take it easy, the lawyers are just doing their job. But that little moment of prickliness tells me something. It tells me this judge might not be happy about being put in the middle of a First Amendment fight involving the Trump family. Or maybe he is annoyed at the legal games being played. I can read his mind. But the tone was notable. Now, let's talk about what's happening with the actual legal arguments, because this is where Melania's strategy starts to fall apart, and this is where that missing $1 billion becomes so important. So Melania is claiming a bunch of different things. She is claiming the New York court doesn't have personal jurisdiction over her because she doesn't really live in New York. She lives in Mar-a-Lago. She's claiming she wasn't properly served. She's claiming this whole case should be dismissed. But at the same time, while she's claiming all of these procedural problems, she's also filed a motion to dismiss the case on the merits. Do you see the problem here? You can have it both ways. You can tell the judge, I am not properly before this court. You have no jurisdiction over me. I wasn't served correctly. And oh, by the way, judge, while I am here, please rule in my favor and dismiss this case completely. That's using the court as both a sword and a shield. Legal experts call this waiver. By asking the judge for affirmative relief, you are waiving your argument that you shouldn't be in that court in the first place. And I think Wolff's lawyers are going to hammer this point. They are going to argue that Melania has waived any jurisdictional objections by actively participating in the case and asking for relief. You can dodge service for 4 months, then show up and demand the judge dismiss the case in your favor. Well, you can try, but it shouldn't work. But here's the really damning part. Remember that $1 billion demand, the one I mentioned at the beginning, the one that's conspicuously missing from all these new federal court filings? In Melania's motion to dismiss, her lawyers describe the October letter. They say, quote, this lawsuit arises from a single October 15, 2025 pre-suit demand email sent by Mrs. Trump's Florida counsel to plaintiff requesting the plaintiff retract and apologize for his numerous false, malicious, and defamatory statements concerning Mrs. Trump, end quote. Requesting a retraction and apology. That's how they describe it. Just a polite request for a retraction and apology. But when you actually read that October email, there's a $1 billion demand in it. $1 billion. They were just leaving that part out, completely omitting it from their description of what happened. And they do this over and over again in their filing. Every time they reference the demand letter, they talk about the request for a retraction, they talk about the request for an apology, but they never ever mention the $1 billion threat. It's like it never happened. Now, why would they do that? I'll tell you what I think. I think they know that $1 billion demand is the whole ballgame, because that's why Michael Wolff went to court. He didn't go to court because someone asked for a retraction. Journalists get requests for retractions all the time. If you are doing real journalism, if you're asking hard questions, people are going to push back. That is normal. But a $1 billion threat? That's not a retraction request. That is an attempt to financially destroy someone. That is an attempt to send a message to every other journalist. Write about the Epstein connections and we will bankrupt you. We will ruin your life. We will take everything you have and everything you will ever have. And the fact that Melania's lawyers are now trying to memory hole that $1 billion demand tells me they know it looks bad. They know it makes this look exactly like what it is, which is an attempt to use the threat of financial destruction to silence journalism about Jeffrey Epstein. Let me read you another part of their motion because this really gets me. They write about how much money Michael Wolff has raised through crowdfunding for his legal defense. $800,000, they say. They mention it twice. $800,000 from crowdfunding. They trying to make it sound like Wolff is getting rich off this, like he is running some kind of scam, but they leave out the context. The context is that Wolff had to raise $800,000 to defend himself against a billion-dollar threat from the former First Lady of the United States. He had to crowdfund his legal defense because Melania Trump and her lawyers, the same lawyers who represent Donald Trump, were trying to crush him financially. That $800,000 isn't a windfall. It's a desperate attempt to survive a legal assault designed to silence him. And the fact that Melania's lawyers are trying to spin it as something suspicious while simultaneously hiding their own billion-dollar demand tells you everything about who is acting in good faith here. Now, let us talk about what happens next, because this case is far from over and it is about to get very interesting. Based on these filings, here's what I think is coming. First, there's going to be a fight over jurisdiction. Is this case properly in federal court? Should it be sent back to state court? Does the federal court have personal jurisdiction over Melania? And to answer those questions, there's going to be discovery. Discovery about where Melania actually lives. How much time she spends in New York versus Florida. How much time she spends at Trump Tower shopping, having spa days, meeting with friends. How much time she spends at Mar-a-Lago. And here's the thing, Melania has now subjected herself to depositions. By filing this motion to dismiss on the merits, by actively participating in this case while also claiming jurisdictional problems, she has opened herself up to the discovery process. Michael Wolff's lawyers are going to depose her. They're going to ask her under oath about where she lives, about her connections to New York, about her relationship with Epstein, about everything. Have a seat, Melania. You're about to be deposed. And I don't think that's what she wanted when she sent that billion-dollar threat back in October. I think she wanted Michael Wolff to fold. I think she expected him to do what so many other journalists have done when faced with legal threats from the rich and powerful, which is back down, retract, apologize, move on. But he didn't. He went to court instead. And now she is stuck in a legal process that's going to require her to answer questions under oath. Questions about Epstein, questions about her modeling career, questions about how she really met Donald, questions she clearly doesn't want to answer. Second, I think Wolff's lawyers are going to argue waiver. They're going to say Melania waived any jurisdictional objections by seeking affirmative relief from the court. You can declaim the court has no power over you and then ask that same court to rule in your favor. Pick one. Either you are not properly before the court, in which case you can ask for anything, or you are before the court, in which case your jurisdictional objections are waived. Third, there's going to be a fight about whether this case should be transferred to Florida. Melania wants it in Florida. Specifically, I believe she wants it in the Southern District of Florida, where there's a chance of getting Judge Cannon. But Wolff is going to fight that. His lawyers are going to argue that New York is the proper venue, that Melania has significant contacts with New York, that this is where the journalism happened, where the publication occurred, where the impact was felt. And frankly, I am worried about this. Because if this case ends up in Florida in front of Judge Cannon, I think we are looking at a very different outcome. I think we were looking at a judge who has shown herself willing to bend the rules to help Trump. And in a case about Epstein, in a case about silencing journalism through billion-dollar threats, I don't trust that we'd get a fair hearing. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Let's just talk about what this case really means. Because this isn't just about one lawsuit. This isn't just about Melania Trump versus Michael Wolff. This is about whether powerful people can use the threat of financial destruction to silence journalism about Jeffrey Epstein. Think about that. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. But the stories about who Epstein knew, who he partied with, who he introduced to each other, who benefited from his connections, those stories are still being written. Those questions are still being asked. And every time a journalist tries to write about those connections, every time someone tries to report on the social circles that Epstein moved in, the people he knew, the powerful people who were in his orbit, there's a risk. There's a risk of a billion-dollar lawsuit. There is a risk of financial ruin. There is a risk of years of expensive litigation. And that risk has a chilling effect. That's what we call it in First Amendment law, a chilling effect. When the threat of legal consequences makes journalists afraid to report on important stories, afraid to ask hard questions, afraid to publish the truth. Melania Trump's billion-dollar demand on Michael Wolff is a textbook example of a chilling effect. Whether she actually intended to sue for $1 billion, whether she actually thought she could win $1 billion, that is almost irrelevant. The point of the threat is to scare journalists, to make them think twice, to make them wonder if they can afford to defend themselves, to make them back down. And the fact that she's now trying to hide that billion-dollar demand, trying to pretend it was just a polite request for a retraction, tells me she knows how bad it looks. She knows it exposes the real strategy. She knows it shows that this was never about correcting false information. This was about silencing journalism about Epstein through the threat of financial destruction. I want to read you some of the comments that people have been leaving about this case because I think they capture something important about how people are reacting to this. One person wrote, "Release the Epstein files and protect the victims." And that comment got massive support because that is what this is really about, isn't it? It's not about protecting Melania's reputation. It's about protecting secrets. It's about making sure certain stories don't get told. It's about keeping the Epstein files, the full unredacted Epstein files, away from public view. Another person wrote, "She's learning from Trump. If you don't like it, sue," and that's exactly right. This is the Trump playbook. Trump has spent his entire career using lawsuits and the threat of lawsuits to bully people into silence. He sued journalists, he sued critics, he sued former employees, and most of the time he doesn't win. But he doesn't have to win. He just has to make it expensive enough that people back down. And now we are seeing Melania adopt the same strategy. Billion-dollar threats, expensive litigation, procedural games, dodging service, moving cases around to try to get friendly judges. This is the Trump family legal strategy applied to the Epstein story. Someone else commented, "You will never see her answer any questions." At this point, they don't answer to any courts anymore. And I felt that comment in my gut. Because there's this sense, and I share it, that the Trump family operates by different rules now, that they can dodge legal process, they can ignore subpoenas, they can refuse to testify, they can file frivolous motions and nothing ever happens. No consequences, no accountability. But here's the thing. Michael Wolff is not backing down. He went to court. He's fighting back. He's raised $800,000 in crowdfunding because people believe in protecting press freedom. People believe that journalists should be able to write about Epstein without being financially destroyed. And now Melania is stuck. She is stuck in a legal process. She is going to have to give a deposition. She is going to have to answer questions under oath. And her lawyers' attempts to hide the billion-dollar demand, their attempts to game the jurisdiction, their attempts to dodge and weave, it's all starting to unravel. Let me tell you what I think happens next. I think Judge Vaucasol, despite being a Trump appointee, is getting annoyed with these games. His tone in his orders suggests he's not happy about the procedural circus he has been handed. I think there is a real chance he denies the motion to dismiss. I think there is a real chance he says, "Look, you can declaim lack of jurisdiction and then ask me to rule on the merits. Pick one." And if that happens, if the motion to dismiss gets denied, then we move to discovery, real discovery, depositions, document requests, questions under oath about Melania's relationship with Epstein, questions about how she met Donald, questions about her modeling career, questions about the social circles she moved in during those years. And here's what Melania's lawyers are terrified of. They re-terrified that discovery will reveal information that is even more damaging than what Michael Wolff has already published. They re-terrified that under oath, under questioning, Melania will have to either tell the truth about things she has spent years hiding, or she'll have to take the Fifth Amendment. And either way, it is a disaster for her, taking the Fifth Amendment, that is the constitutional right against self-incrimination. You can be forced to testify against yourself. But here's the problem. In a civil case like this one, if you take the Fifth, the judge and jury are allowed to draw negative inferences from that. They allowed to assume that if you refusing to answer, it's because the answer would be damaging to you. So if Melania gets deposed and starts taking the Fifth on questions about Epstein, on questions about how she met Donald, on questions about her past, that's almost as bad as answering the questions honestly, because everyone will assume she is hiding something. Everyone will assume the truth is worse than what has already been reported. One commenter wrote something that really stuck with me. Melania is probably in the Epstein files and in a lot of their pictures together. Now, I don't know if that is true. I can verify that. But the fact that people are wondering about it, the fact that these questions are being asked, tells you why Melania is so desperate to silence this story. Because the Epstein story isn't over. Those files still exist, those photos still exist, and every time someone writes about the people in Epstein's orbit, every time someone asks questions about who knew what and when, there is a risk that more information comes out, more photos, more flight logs, more witness statements. And maybe Melania is in those files. Maybe she is in those photos. Maybe there are things about her relationship with Epstein, her relationship with Donald, her modeling career, her path to America that she really doesn't want people knowing about. Or maybe she is innocent. Maybe Wolff got it wrong. Maybe there's nothing there. But here's the thing. If there's nothing there, why the billion-dollar threat? If there's nothing there, why dodge service for 4 months? If there's nothing there, why hire Trump as lawyers and start playing these jurisdictional games? Innocent people don't usually respond to journalism by threatening to financially destroy the journalist. Innocent people usually respond by providing evidence that the reporting is wrong. They do interviews, they release documents, they tell their side of the story. But Melania isn't doing that. She is lawyering up. She is making billion-dollar threats. She is trying to move the case to Florida to get a friendly judge. She is doing everything except actually addressing the substance of what Michael Wolff reported. And that tells me something. It tells me there is something there. Something she's desperate to keep hidden. Something worth spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to protect. Something worth risking a deposition to prevent from coming out. Now, I could be wrong about this. Maybe I am reading too much into the legal maneuvering. Maybe this really is just about correcting false reporting and Melania is confident she'll win. But I don't think so. I think the billion-dollar demand that is now being memory holed from the court filings tells the real story. Let me talk about the bigger picture for a minute, because this case is happening in a context that's deeply disturbing. We rewatching a systematic assault on press freedom in this country. Trump has spent years attacking the media as fake news, as the enemy of the people. He has threatened to change libel laws to make it easier to sue journalists. He has called for reporters to be jailed. He has revoked press credentials. He has encouraged violence against journalists at his rallies. And now we are seeing his family members adopt the same tactics. Billion-dollar threats against journalists who write about Epstein. Attempts to use the court system to silence reporting. Attempts to bankrupt critics through expensive litigation. This is not normal. This is not how people who believe in the First Amendment behave. This is not how people who believe in a free press behave. This is authoritarian behavior. This is the behavior of people who believe they should be able to control what gets reported about them. People who believe their power entitles them to silence critics. And the Epstein angle makes it even more sinister, because the Epstein story is about power. It's about how wealthy, connected people were able to abuse vulnerable victims for years while everyone looked the other way. It's about how Epstein built relationships with princes and presidents and billionaires. It's about how those relationships protected him until they didn't. And the people who were in Epstein's orbit, the people who partied with him, who flew on his plane, who visited his island, who benefited from his connections, those people have every reason to want that story buried. They have every reason to want journalists afraid to write about it. They have every reason to use legal threats to chill reporting. That's what I think is happening here. I think Melania's billion-dollar threat is part of a broader effort to silence Epstein journalism, to make it too expensive, too risky, too dangerous for journalists to ask hard questions about who Epstein knew and what they knew. And if this tactic works, if Melania can bankrupt Michael Wolff or scare him into silence, then every other journalist is going to think twice before writing about Epstein connections. They're going to wonder if they can afford the legal bills. They're going to wonder if their publishers will back them. They're going to wonder if it's worth the risk. That S, the chilling effect. That S, the goal. And we have to resist it. Here's what I want you to understand. This case matters. It matters for press freedom. It matters for the Epstein story. It matters for whether powerful people can use billion-dollar threats to silence journalism. Michael Wolff is fighting back. He went to court. He raised money from people who believe in protecting the First Amendment. He not backing down despite the billion-dollar threat, despite the procedural games, despite facing the Trump family legal machine. But he needs support. Not just financial support, though that matters. He needs people to pay attention. He needs people to understand what's at stake. He needs people to demand that the Epstein files get released, that the full story gets told, that journalists can do their jobs without being threatened with financial destruction. So here's what you can do. First, pay attention to this case. Follow the court filings. Share reporting about it. Don't let this slip by unnoticed. The Trump family is counting on this being too complex, too boring, too legal for regular people to care about. Prove them wrong. Second, support journalism about Epstein. Read the reporting. Share it. Defend journalists who are doing this work. When you see billion-dollar threats being used to silence reporting, call it out. Make noise about it. Third, demand the release of the full, unredacted Epstein files. Contact your representatives. Make it clear that you want the full truth about Epstein's connections, about who knew what, about who was in his orbit. Don't accept redactions. Don't accept missing pages. The law requires transparency. Demand it. Fourth, and this is important, don't let them normalize this. Don't let billion-dollar threats against journalists become just another story. Don't let the systematic assault on press freedom become background noise. Every time you see it happening, react, speak up. Push back, because here's what terrifies me. If Melania succeeds in silencing Michael Wolff, if she succeeds in making this billion-dollar threat work, then it becomes a template. Then every powerful person with Epstein connections knows they can do the same thing. Threaten journalists with financial destruction. Move cases around to get friendly judges. Play procedural games to avoid accountability. And the Epstein story, the full Epstein story, never gets told. The victims never get full justice. The people who enabled him, who partied with him, who knew what he was doing, they all get to hide behind legal threats and billion-dollar lawsuits. I am not going to let that happen without a fight. I am going to keep covering this case. I am going to keep reading those court filings. I am going to keep explaining what is happening and why it matters. And I need you with me on this. Look, I know this is heavy. I know it is disturbing to think about the former First Lady using billion-dollar threats to silence journalism about Epstein. I know it's exhausting to watch the legal games, the procedural maneuvering, the attempts to get friendly judges. But we don't get to look away. We don't get to pretend this isn't happening, because if we do, if we let this slide, then they win. The people who want to bury the Epstein story, they win. The people who think power entitles them to silence critics, they win. And I'm not ready to let them win. I don't think you are either, so stay with me on this. Keep paying attention. Keep demanding accountability. Keep supporting journalists who are doing the hard, dangerous work of reporting on power, on Epstein, on the connections that powerful people desperately want to keep hidden, because that S how we win. Not through billion-dollar lawsuits, not through friendly judges, not through legal tricks and procedural games. We win by refusing to be silenced, by refusing to look away, by demanding the truth no matter how uncomfortable it makes powerful people. Melania Trump tried to make this go away with a billion-dollar threat. Instead, she's facing depositions, discovery, and a legal fight that's going to keep the Epstein questions alive. That's not what she wanted, but it's what journalism in a free society requires. I'll keep following this case. I'll keep reporting on what happens next. And I hope you'll be right there with me, because we're all in this together. The fight for press freedom, the fight for truth, the fight to make sure the Epstein story gets fully told, that's what matters. That's what's at stake.